I'd like to welcome you to this program about the Iraq endgame. And I have sort of the best and worst job tonight. The best job is we have two very distinguished people to discuss the subject of the future of U.S. involvement. The worst job is I'm going to have to cut them off after a couple of minutes so we have enough time for questions. And the other thing is I have to weed through all the questions that some of you have already submitted as well as in the audience. But I will do my best, and according to the program they gave me, we're supposed to have all this done by 7:15. So let's see what we can do. Our two panelists tonight, and I'll introduce them in the order that they will speak, and you've got their biography, so I won't have to go into great detail. Dr. Fred Kagan, who is a resident scholar in defense and security policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He's a military historian, written very, very widely on the subject. There are very few people who know more about warfare and the history of warfare that can comment on the situation on the ground in Iraq. And he's had a big role intellectually in some of the strategy that the President adopted about a little over a year ago. Both of our speakers have taught at West Point, among other things. And our other panelist tonight is Professor Richard Norton, who is a professor in the Departments of International Relations and Anthropology at Boston University. He is an expert in the Middle East and all of the culture and the history of that area. In fact, he's on leave right now, writing a book about the Sunni-Shia rift. He, among his other accomplishments, both of them have PhDs, and Richard is also a retired Army colonel with 3 years in combat zones. So we really have two people who I think can focus on where we are, where we ought to go. Now, I'm going to spend a couple of minutes in setting the stage. We all know that the war is in its 6th year. The 5th anniversary was last year. There have been high costs, both in terms of lives for us and the Iraqis, as well as financial costs. We do know that the violence got very high in the middle of last year, starting in 2006. And it has come down now, though events in the last couple of days wonder if that's going to be permanent or whether it will stay down for a long period of time. We do know that in the last year we have what people call a surge. We have sent more troops, but because we don't have a large enough ground forces, the surge will end this summer in terms of the extra 30,000 troops. The question the President himself is deciding this week after consultations with General Petraeus and Admiral Fallon and the Joint Chiefs of Staff is whether to take a pause, whether to keep it going. We know there have been other things that have happened in the last year. You've had the so-called awakening, where many of the former Sunni insurgents have partnered with us, and they were called the concerned local citizens. They're now known as the Sons of Iraq, and because of them partnering with us, the violence has gone down, particularly in Al-Anbar province. You've also had Muqtada al-Sadr has laid down his arms, but again, we don't know what will happen as a result of the last couple of days. And the question is, okay, where do we go from here? Should we pause with the drawdown of the troops? What are the costs and benefits of staying? What are the costs and benefits of leaving? And if we leave, under what circumstances should we leave? And what will tell us when we've achieved our goals? And also, what are our goals? So with that introduction, let me ask Fred Kagan to come to the podium.
Larry, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming out to talk about this important topic. I was told that I have to speak very briefly, so in a nutshell, Iraq surge, winning good. Okay, thanks. In December of 2006, we were unequivocally losing the war in Iraq. And that was my evaluation. It was the evaluation of the command in Iraq. The strategy was not working. And we were headed, the Iraqis were headed toward full-scale sectarian civil war. And there was no question about that. And you saw a mobilization of the Iraqi people to fight a full-scale sectarian civil war, in that individuals outside of organized groups pursuing political objectives, individuals started to form vigilante groups in their own neighborhoods and attack people of the other sect, either in their own neighborhoods or outside. And that's sort of the marker of a transition from an insurgency where you have multiple sides, where you have organized groups that are using violence, including against civilians, to pursue political objectives, and an actual full-scale sectarian conflict where, people in each sect are just going after people in the other sect. We started to see that develop in mid-2006, and by the end of 2006, it looked like it was headed in an absolutely uncontrollable trajectory. What we have seen over the past 15 months is that it turns out that the Iraqi people were not, in fact, committed to or even desirous of having that kind of full-scale civil war. And given the opportunity to mobilize instead to resist those who were bringing violence into their neighborhoods, they did. That was the nature of the Awakening movement, and it was the nature of a variety of movements on the ground outside of the Awakenings that have led to the assistance that the Iraqi population has given to American and Iraqi forces to bring the violence under control. And so I think that it is fair to say at this point the civil war is over. There is not now a civil war in Iraq in the sense that you have communities mobilizing to kill each other. To the extent that you have popular mobilization on the ground, it is mobilization against people whom they label as terrorists and insurgents. Interestingly, that mobilization does include some former terrorists and insurgents, which tells you something about their belief in how this is going to come out. The civil war that emerged in 2006 was overlaid on the Sunni insurgency, which we had been combating since 2003 rather ineffectively. And that insurgency was based on the premise that the Sunni were not going to accept a Shia government and were going to use force to resist it, and were not going to participate in the political process. That has also been defeated in the sense that the overwhelming majority of the Sunni Arab community in Iraq has decided that it is not going to use force at this point to pursue its further objectives, but it is instead going to attempt to achieve its objectives through the political process. Which brings me to the last point, which is that the Sunni insurgency and then the escalating civil war created fertile ground for al-Qaeda to establish itself in Iraq, which it did very early on, and then to establish safe havens around the country. And by the end of 2006, al-Qaeda globally and in Iraq clearly thought that it was winning in Iraq, and you could have made a pretty damn good case for it. They had very substantial urban and rural sanctuaries throughout the country, in Anbar and Baghdad, up the Diyala, up the Tigris, down the Euphrates, and it looked like they were doing very well. I think it is also now fair to say that al-Qaeda in Iraq has been defeated in the sense that it no longer stands any measurable chance of actually achieving its objective of establishing an Islamic state of the sort that it desires, with the support of the Iraqi people, even of the Sunni population. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't going to continue to be violence caused by al-Qaeda as well as by Shia extremist groups. It is still a war. These enemies have not conceded. Very briefly, where are we going to head with this? From a military standpoint, if you simply do the analysis of what kinds of forces are required in Iraq to maintain and extend the current gains, the idea of going below 15 brigades this year is virtually inconceivable. In reality, I think that the actual requirement is more like 17 to 18 brigades. And I will be happy to talk with, if anyone's interested in why that is so and what that does for you. But I do think that we are entering a potentially transformative period in Iraqi politics and Iraqi society. There will be provincial elections on October 1st of this year, and there will be new elections to the Iraqi parliament by the end of next year. And based on numerous trips to Iraq, including my most recent in February, I do believe that the Iraqi political dynamic is changing very fundamentally, and that if these elections are held at the same sort of standard in terms of fairness and legitimacy as the previous elections in Iraq were held, then you will see a sea change in the nature of the Iraqi political discourse over the coming year, which can, in fact, give us the opportunity to see success in Iraq in the sense of a stable, democratic country that is an ally in the war on terror. I have not, those of you who don't know me, I have not been spinning this line since 2003. I've been rather down on how things were going prior to the implementation of the surge. So for what it's worth, this is a new perspective for me as well. But I do think that it is possible, that success is possible, and I think that it will be worth it, not only in terms of warding off the dangers that failure would bring upon us, but also in the positive benefits that it can bring us. I look forward to your questions.
Well, it's very nice to be with you tonight. May I have the map, please? I think we have a map that you can take a look at, which will show Iraq. Maybe that will, there it is, great. I'm very pleased to be with you tonight. I, first of all, want to say that I'm a great admirer of the Foreign Policy Association. I participated in Foreign Policy Association events for the last quarter century or so, written a few pieces over the years for the association, and also had the pleasure of participating in innumerable numbers of discussions of great decisions around the country. So I just want to start by not talking about Iraq, but saluting the Foreign Policy Association for all the good things that it does, and thank all of you in the audience who support it. I have a rather different perspective than what you've just heard. First of all, I think that the surge, as it's called, has been, in a technical sense, a success. As I was telling our moderator before we came in, I've known both of the principals who are involved in running the show in Iraq for a very long time. Brian Crocker, the ambassador, is a man I've known for almost 30 years. We first were together in Lebanon many, many years ago. And General Dave Petraeus is a friend and former colleague from the West Point faculty. These are two people who are as capable as you might possibly imagine. We're very fortunate to have more or less exactly the right people we should have on the scene running the show. And they have overseen a significant improvement in the situation. But the Iraq War is not close to being a success. In fact, it's a horrible failure on many levels. And there's not much we can do that can change that fact. We can mitigate the failure, which is really what we need to think about doing. For the Iraqi people, it certainly hasn't been a success. There's an organization in Britain, Iraq Body Count, which keeps track of casualties in Iraq. They're the most conservative organization that counts civilian casualties. They estimate, based on multiple confirmations and so on, that about 90,000 Iraqi civilians have died. Estimates or studies, I should say, published in the New England Journal of Medicine in January for the period 2003 to 2006 come up with a higher number using statistically dependable techniques, namely 151,000 civilian deaths. There have been estimates of as high as 1 million civilian deaths since the U.S. invasion. Whether the Iraq body count numbers are correct or the higher numbers, there's been a substantial civilian toll in Iraq. And unfortunately, this has affected the attitude towards the U.S., both in Iraq and outside the country. For U.S. soldiers, certainly there's been a horrible cost. And one of the problems we have right now is that our Army has been stretched almost to the breaking point. The generals don't talk about it very much, and they prefer not to do it publicly because the data is so scary. But what's happening right now is you're losing an immense number of junior leaders from the Army, particularly experienced captains and in some cases majors. I can't give you full details because it would reveal my source, and I don't want to compromise the source. But studies have been done which show that among the young officers leaving are those that tend to have the most combat experience, tend to have the best performance records, and the best college educations. So we're really losing the best of our young men and women from the commission ranks. As someone who spent a lot of time thinking about the Vietnam War and fighting in Vietnam, and having to serve as an officer in the Army following the Vietnam War, I can tell you that the period of time that it takes an Army to recover from that kind of damage is not trivial. It takes years and years. In fact, when I was serving at West Point in the 1980s, many of the young, bright officers who I was serving with, today many of them are generals actually, were people who were very self-conscious about recovering from the damages of that earlier conflict. So there are really finite limits in terms of what we can do. Fred might be right that 17 or 18 combat brigades might be a good solution, but frankly speaking, when you begin to crunch the numbers, it's tough to come up with those numbers. So we're really faced with some real limitations. Moreover, I don't have to tell you about the economy and the effect that the war has had on the economy. The war is costing approximately $5,000 a second. If I'm successful in speaking only for 5 minutes, that will have cost you $1,500,000 in terms of Iraqi spending levels. So from the standpoint of many of the structural constraints we face here in our own system, we have some pretty severe issues to grapple with. Now, a key question for Iraq is the Civil War over? Is the Civil War over? This is what Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki said last week. He said the Civil War is over. He declared that, in fact. I must say, I've studied civil wars. I've lived in civil wars. And what I've learned is that these wars don't always keep the same character day after day. They change. The constellation of forces change. Militias and other groups participating build new alliances. And also they create their own, if you will, militia economies with a vested interest in maintaining them. So what we can say right now is that the Civil War is quiet right now. I think it's very optimistic to say the Civil War has ended. I hope it is, frankly, ended. But I'm a little bit skeptical of that claim. As we speak today, there's heavy fighting going on in Basra. Basra down here in southern Iraq, of course the third largest city. It's a city which the British nominally controlled, but basically the city has been controlled by militias for the past several years. Iranian influence there is very, very strong. As we speak, heavy fighting is going on in Basra. The Iraqi army, and in fact the Prime Minister is on the scene as well, has launched a campaign against one of the major Shi'i militias, Muqtada al-Sadr's militia, the Jaish al-Mahdi. Whether or not this is going to be a successful campaign, we don't know yet. What we do know is one of the things that has made the surge successful is that this very important militia under Muqtada al-Sadr has been maintaining a ceasefire since last August. If that ceasefire comes unstuck, we may be into a new game. We may be into a new game. So we'll see. Now, when you think about these militias, by the way, we tend to simplify when we talk about Kurds and Sunnis and Shi'is. And I must say, most of us now, we've been following this war, we have a pretty sophisticated understanding. I'll finish in just a minute or so, Larry. But we have a pretty sophisticated understanding now from reading the newspapers. But still, these categories are not enough. So, for example, within the Shi'i community, you have some very substantial differences based on differences of class and privilege and access to power and so on. So, from one perspective, for example, what's going on in Basra may be the central government putting down a significant militia, bringing Basra under control, but it may also be the central government acting as a sort of agent of some of the other major militia structures in the country. And we don't know enough yet to know whether that's the case or not. So we're faced with a very, very difficult situation. We think of ourselves as liberators. Technically speaking, the UN, through its resolutions, has legitimated the U.S. occupation of Iraq. But from the standpoint of the Iraqi people, that doesn't wash. From the standpoint of the average Iraqis, what they're experiencing is American ihtilal, or occupation, or American istimar, or colonialism. This is the dominant narrative. So don't put too many bets on, and I won't say the awakening that's taking place in Iraq, basically keeping people at bay. I would emphasize awakenings, because this phenomenon actually has many different forms. So don't put too much of a bet on the situation staying calm vis-a-vis any of these communities, at least vis-a-vis the Sunni community or the Shia community and U.S. forces. It's all very, very, it seems to me, perishable at this point in terms of many of our assumptions. I'll close by saying, and certainly I especially look forward to your questions, that it's obvious, I think, and on this point Fred Kagan and I probably agree emphatically, that what you can't do, given the present situation in Iraq, is leave very quickly. And the question is, what are the terms of reference for leaving? How fast you're going to draw down? What kind of residual presence is likely to be there, and for how long? But frankly speaking, we put ourselves in a kind of self-checkmate situation where we're not going to be able to leave very quickly. I must say that's what I very much feared was going to happen more than 5 years ago. But in any case, I'm not particularly happy that it has. But that's the reality. Thank you very much.
There's been repeated talk about staying, quote, until we win. Would both of you please define what winning would be?
Okay. Fred?
As I said in my opening remarks, winning is, for me, is a stable, democratic, legitimate Iraqi government that is an ally in the war against Islamist extremism. That's what winning is to me, and I think that that's attainable.
Is it the same for the Iraqis?
I guess the question becomes, some people have argued that the administration has dumbed down its goals, that they no longer, it's sort of a negative goal rather than the positive goal. And there was an article, somebody mentioned it in here in the Washington Post this week, where they had this colonel in Fallujah in the Iraqi police that said, Iraqi, no democracy, it's always been ruled by a strongman.
Yes, as my colleague can testify, colonels say a variety of interesting things which are not necessarily canonical. Having worked for many colonels in my time, I'll stand by that.
Okay.
Look, I don't think the administration has dumbed down its goals, in the sense that I don't think that President Bush has walked away from this as his objective, and I don't believe that General Petraeus has either. A variety of people, we can absolutely have a discussion about whether this is attainable or not.
Okay. Richard, do you want to comment?
I just want to say that I'm very skeptical that Iraq will become a democracy, as we understand it, anytime soon. And my reading of the administration, both in Iraq and in the region in general, is that the enthusiasm for the democratic objective has disappeared. So I think stability would be enough. If you can attain stability in Iraq and an ally that would basically help us to ensure that there's not a significant threat of terrorism aimed at us and our friends, that would probably be the best you can get.
Would you accept an autocrat, a dictator, or strongman?
Well, let me tell you this. At a talk in Washington in May of 2003, I said, the day will come when a man on horseback will ride into Iraq and you'll welcome him with flowers and candy. And I must say I stand by that. And if Nouri al-Maliki or anybody else can establish control in that country, we're not going to be too worried about the integrity with which they respect the principles of democracy.
Okay. Let me go to another question that's been written. Fred, somebody says that, I guess they're quoting Sun Tzu, that said the military force has a political objective, and the objective of the surge was to get the Iraqis to make the political compromises. Have they done enough in your estimation, given the level of that violence has gone down, and what can we do to get them to do more?
The Iraqis have made remarkable strides politically over the past couple of months. In fact, I've been surprised by the amount of progress that they've made. If you go back and look at the congressional benchmarks, of which I was never a fan because I'm not a fan of checklists, but that's the sort of measure of merit these days for political progress, I think you can make a good case that the Iraqis have met about 12 out of 18 benchmarks and made progress on another 5. They have notably passed 4 out of the 5 benchmark laws that were identified. The only one that they haven't passed is the hydrocarbons law, a problem which is mitigated somewhat but not completely by the passage of a 2008 budget which addressed the question of oil revenue sharing, which is why we thought we cared about that law, though it's not why we should. So there's been a lot of progress, actually, in terms of meeting the benchmarks. But as I said, I was never that excited about the benchmarks to begin with, and I never thought this problem was going to be resolved by legislation coming out of the COR. And I think that's actually more symptomatic than causal of anything. What it's symptomatic of is what I saw and felt most dramatically on my most recent trip there, which is the development for the first time, I think, of the beginnings of issues politics in Iraq. So that, this is especially noticeable in the Shia community, where for the first time, I think, it's not enough for leaders like Nouri al-Maliki or Adel Abdul Mehdi to say, I am a Shia, you must support me because I am a Shia. Now, increasingly, local Shia are saying, that's very nice, but what are you actually doing for me? And that has put a tremendous amount of bottom-up pressure on the Iraqi government. And when you talk, as I did, to Iraqi governors, especially Shia governors, they're very concerned about being voted out of office in October. And to me, that's the most promising sign of the early development of an actual political discourse in Iraq.
Okay. Richard, someone wants to know that advocates of an early withdrawal maintain that this would force the Iraqi factions to negotiate with each other. Is that a plausible rationale?
I think that, well, it depends on the pace of the withdrawal, obviously. I think that setting an ironclad date for withdrawal is probably a mistake. That's my view. And while I'm impressed with certain political candidates who talk about leaving Iraq and so on, I'm also impressed by their likely intelligence when presented with the facts, which is to say, I think that those plans are likely to be mitigated substantially. So if by an early withdrawal we mean basically packing up our things and leaving as quickly as we can, I think that would be a very bad idea. I think it would cause an enormous amount of problems in the neighborhood, so to speak, and it would certainly pour gasoline on the Civil War.
Okay, good. We're now ready to go back to the audience. Yes, ma'am, right here. Yes, please.
My question is, I heard that Iran was funding the Iraqi police and that we were funding neighborhood militias in order to keep the death toll down. Is there any truth to that? I'm asking both of you.
Well, we are funding militias. I mean, basically, the awakenings, these local militias that have emerged in places like Al-Diyala and Anbar and so on, are being paid directly by the U.S., $300 a month, I think. Mm-hmm. And of course, in the past, we've directly funded various security institutions. But, for example, the police, I don't know how much money the Iranians are putting in. Certainly it's not insubstantial. But a lot of these groups finance themselves through corruption. You know, to the extent that, for example, the police are routinely implicated, have been routinely implicated in kidnapping schemes, various extortion schemes, and so on. So there's a lot of sort of self-financing. And, for example, one of the reasons that I mentioned Muqtada al-Sadr before. One of the reasons many of his people were uncomfortable with the ceasefire that he declared last August is a lot of their income-earning opportunities were reduced. You see?
So isn't it a conflict? Isn't it like a conflict if Iran is funding the police and we're funding the militia and the police are fighting against the militia? And
Iran is not funding the police.
What? Sorry?
Iran is not funding the police.
They're not.
No.
What are they
Absolutely
funding
not.
anything?
Yes, the Iranians are heavily funding, as Dr. Norton said, are heavily funding Shia militias, particularly special groups, which have a very complicated relationship with JAM, but which are in fact controlled by IRGC Quds Force officers, normally through Lebanese Hezbollah intermediaries in Iraq. And the amount of money is substantial, although Dr. Norton is right. The militias make a lot of money on their own. But the Iranians are not funding any police, except in the sense that you have some militia infiltration of the police. I think it's inappropriate to call the Sons of Iraq movement, as we're now calling what the movement formerly known as Concerned Local Citizens, to call that a militia, because to my mind, the operative definition of a militia is an armed organization that operates outside the law. And that is absolutely not what the Sons of Iraq movement is. The Sons of Iraq movement operates within the framework of the Iraqi government structures. They owe allegiance. They swear allegiance either directly or indirectly to the Iraqi government, and we supply a variety of information about them to the Iraqi government. And just to correct one myth which is out there very frequently, we do not arm them. We do not provide weapons to Sons of Iraq anywhere. We don't do that. What we do is pay them.
Okay. In the back.
As an aside to the comment
Speak as loud as you can.
As an aside to the comment on the possible appropriation of Iraqi oil revenues, it's perhaps worth noting that 5% of Iraqi oil revenues are directed to reparations for the first Gulf War, the invasion of Kuwait, in 1990-91. And that's done under UN resolutions and is, as I understand it, a source of great resentment among the Iraqi government officials. That's just 5%. My question picks up Dr. Kagan's point about nascent political development in Iraq. And whether it's possible to have peace, security, and other things that we would term victory in the absence of a government that is perceived to be legitimate. It seems that one of the lessons of Vietnam is that you can pour in as many resources and troops and training as you like, but if what you're doing is propping up a government which is perceived locally as inefficient and corrupt, you're not going to get anywhere.
Richard, do you want to try that?
Yeah, well, first of all, you're quite right about the reparations. And in fact, the Kuwaiti government, which was the victim of the 1990 invasion, has been approached and asked to basically stop the reparations, and they said no way. So that's still very much going on. It will be going on into the future. Your point about the legitimacy of the government is right on target, it seems to me. I mean, from the standpoint of many of the people involved, for example, in these awakenings, I would call them militias, and I'll defend that. But from the standpoint of people involved in the militias, the Sunni militias at least, the government is an alien government. In fact, they refer to it as the government of Iranians or Persians. So those sentiments run very, very deep. And what we have not seen, there have been some recent promising steps. For example, legislation passed last month with regard to the elections and amnesty for ex-Baathists and all of that. These are important steps, but they have to go much, much further in order for those walls of separation to disappear. Right now, they're very, very severe. And with respect to the awakenings, and there are some Shi'i groups as well that are participating in this program, it is true that these groups do pledge allegiance to the state and all of that, but we have documented cases, a fair number of them, of their challenging legitimate representatives of the state. They're sort of pushing out of the way elected political representatives and so on. So they haven't necessarily always done what they said they were going to do or lived up to the standards that they said they were going to live up to, except that they haven't attacked the U.S. soldiers for the most part.
Fred, do you want to answer?
Yeah. Well, if your standard is perfection, I can guarantee you, as you well know, that it will never be met in Iraq or anywhere else. As for the point about Kuwaiti reparations, it's unconscionable that the Kuwaitis won't waive those. If everyone who visits Iraq goes through Kuwait City, and you should see all the construction going on. It's quite a place. They don't need the money. It's a reflection of the fact that the Arab governments have not yet accepted the Iraqi government because they see it as a Shia Persian government, and you hear that all the time. Interestingly, by the way, when I was talking to the governor of Karbala, I think it was, he also said they were Persians, and he's a Shia. So this is not just a Sunni thing, although Dr. Norton is absolutely right that it runs deep in the Sunni community. And the questioner is absolutely right. No, there is no prospect for stability in a country absent some sort of absolutist dictatorship, which I would never support, if the government is seen as illegitimate. That's why it is incredibly important that we help shepherd the Iraqis through the next two elections in a way that is inclusive of the Sunni community, that gives the leaders of some of these Saqqa movements, the awakening movements, and others in the Sunni community and in the Shia community the opportunity to run for office and see themselves actually represented. Various factions, including elements within the government, will certainly try to rig the elections or deter people from voting or get people to vote in certain ways, unquestionably. One of our challenges will be to do what we can to mitigate that. Fortunately, in this regard, we have a very powerful ally in the UN Special Representative, Staffan de Mistura, whom I had the pleasure to meet in Baghdad on one of our compounds, who is profoundly committed to ensuring free and legitimate elections and to working very closely with us to make that happen. And I think that as Senator Clinton has called for an increase in the UN role in Iraq, we actually have already seen a significant increase in the UN role in Iraq, and it's a very positive thing, and I hope that it will continue.
Okay. One question for both of you. What should be the relative priorities of Afghanistan and Iraq?
Afghanistan is terribly important. If there is a legitimate concern with Al-Qaeda, it's a concern that geographically centers on the northwest province of Pakistan and Afghanistan. And I worry a lot, and I think many people worry a lot, about the extent to which we may not be succeeding in Afghanistan. We've had to twist a lot of arms from our European allies to get significant troop contributions. We haven't had too much luck, although I gather today the French said they're going to send more forces, which is good news.
Merci.
So I think we are putting inadequate attention on Afghanistan. I'm one of those people who felt that we should have finished the job that we started when we invaded in 2001. I think it's a pity that we didn't. I think we're paying the cost of not having done so today. And the situation is becoming more complicated because I'm sure you've been following the results of the Pakistani elections. The new government in Pakistan has told us in no uncertain terms that they're not sort of buying on to our anti-terrorism program. So we're going to have a much more difficult time conducting these selective operations in the northwest province of Pakistan and so on, and that will necessarily impact on neighboring Afghanistan. So that's a major area of concern, and it's one that we really need to be paying a lot of attention to. And unfortunately, at various times, the Iraq War has diverted us from that area, and I think that's a great pity.
Fred?
I would like to... Can I talk all night, Larry? I've got a lot to say about this. I'm also concerned about what's going on in Afghanistan, but I completely disagree that from the standpoint of worrying about al-Qaeda, that Afghanistan is the priority. Speaking to that theater first, there is very little al-Qaeda presence in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda does not maintain large bases in Afghanistan. The forces that we're fighting in Afghanistan primarily are Taliban forces, which in some areas have been al-Qaeda-sized and in other areas have not been as much, and a handful of al-Qaeda fighters who frankly come in mostly to either have the pleasure of killing Americans or to get experience using their weapons in live-fire exercises, not really for anything else. And the reason is very simple. Afghanistan is a large pile of rocks, and it has virtually nothing of interest to anyone with the exception of poppies, and poppies are great, but there will not be a lack
Some people like...
there will not be a lack of opium trade for al-Qaeda to tap into, whether it's in Afghanistan or not. The prize for al-Qaeda is Pakistan. And increasingly we've seen that the al-Qaeda movement that is based in Pakistan is focused on Islamabad and not on Kabul. And the bases that we need to be concerned about that are permanent bases where the al-Qaeda leaders are out with the swimming pools and the palm trees and the whole 9 yards, and I'm not entirely kidding, are areas in Chitral, which is in the northwest frontier province, and in Waziristan, which is in the federally administered tribal areas, which are not even legally part of Pakistan in the same way that Pakistan's other provinces are. So the problem that I have with the assertion that Afghanistan is where we really should be is that we could throw 500,000 troops into Afghanistan, crunch all of the insurgents, make it a peaceful place, and find some way to get the economy going there, and it would do very little to address the actual al-Qaeda problem, which isn't there. And I think it's incredibly important that we focus on this, and I think it's incredibly important that we succeed in Afghanistan, and I think it's incredibly important that we develop a regional strategy to figure out how to go after the al-Qaeda safe havens that are in Pakistan. But that is, at this point, fundamentally a Pakistani problem, and I, for one, am rather reluctant to recommend a military solution to that problem. So I think that when you actually parse the al-Qaeda problem in South Asia closely, you see that the issue of troop levels in Afghanistan is secondary. But I also want to take just a minute, and I'll be brief, Larry, I promise, to attack another myth which is prevalent, which is that al-Qaeda in Iraq is somehow not really al-Qaeda. It absolutely is. There is no question that the al-Qaeda in Iraq franchise is part of the global al-Qaeda movement. It swears fealty to Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden recognizes it. It was interesting. The New York Times, not very long ago, released a list of all of bin Laden's statements since 2001. About a third of them were devoted to Iraq. Most of those, especially the more recent ones, in terms that made it very clear that for him, Iraq is absolutely a major front and an area that he's very concerned about. And look, this is the sort of conversation that you can only have if you don't go there and talk with our soldiers who capture these guys, who interrogate them, and see these guys. I went down to Camp Bucca this last time where we hold these detainees, and I spoke with some of the detainees, which was an interesting experience, and of course with our guys who talk with them all the time. There's no question about the very close relationship between that movement, particularly its leadership, and the global al-Qaeda movement. So we have a situation where in Iraq we are fighting al-Qaeda every day. Are these the guys who attacked us on 9/11? No. This is a franchise of the movement which has metastasized since that attack. Right. But we're fighting that franchise every day in Iraq. In Afghanistan, we're fundamentally fighting Taliban and very few al-Qaeda. That doesn't mean that it's not important. But it does mean that the importance of Afghanistan to the global war on terror is secondary, whereas the importance of Iraq and Pakistan are primary. But because Pakistan is primary does not equal that we should be throwing a lot of forces into Afghanistan necessarily, although it's a discussion obviously we should have.
Okay, I can see, Captain Taylor. Noel, your next panel is going to be... we have a group of high school students here. Do any of you have a question? Nope.
Put them on the spot like that?
Yeah. Not? Okay, well, I didn't want you to be intimidated here. I thought I would...
I think you intimidated them more.
If I may add one thing.
Yeah, go ahead, Paula. We'll give you a couple of seconds to think
while you're collecting your questions. Look, there are probably about 40,000 really bad guys out there who are Muslim extremists in the world. About 40,000, let's say. That's about, if you look at all Muslims in the world, let's say there are 1.2 billion Muslims in the world. That means that 99.99998% are not a problem, right? It's those fractions, those fractions of 10,000ths, if you will, of the total number that's a problem, about 40,000. And there are more of them today than there were when we invaded Iraq, because Iraq has served as a kind of recruiting poster for al-Qaeda. There's no doubt about that. We can find significant numbers of al-Qaeda sympathizers, franchises, whatever you like to call them, and they vary, in Morocco, for example. Find significant numbers in Saudi Arabia. Find substantial numbers in Jordan. Find non-trivial numbers in Egypt. It's a global phenomenon that we're dealing with right now. and it's going to be with us for a very, very long time. But we need to be clear about the fact that we're probably talking about 40,000, maybe 50,000 really bad people, and not take actions that basically alienate the 99.9999% of Muslims. Now, that means that, for example, in a place like Iraq, we need to be paying attention, as we are, to the conditions under which people are living, trying to maintain level of stability and so on. But we're not going to be able to solve the al-Qaeda problem completely in Iraq. We're not going to be able to solve it anywhere anytime soon. In Afghanistan, which I referenced, and of course, Afghanistan and Pakistan are sort of joined at the hip. There's no way of sort of disconnecting those problems. My concern there is that you have a situation where the control of many of the provinces today is up in the air, right? That the central government in Kabul has very tenuous control over these areas. And there is this kind of connection between the Northwest province and so on. So, you know, it's not the only al-Qaeda problem, but it's a significant al-Qaeda problem, and it will get worse if that country becomes more unstable over time. And that's why we need to pay an awful lot of attention to it, in my opinion. But it's a global problem we're dealing with.
Okay, over there.
We've heard that we could be in Iraq for 100 years. Are anybody here willing to maybe refine that number a little bit? And kind of come up with, Dr. Kagan, you I think said we're going to be perhaps out of there by the end of next year. Everything's going to be perfect. It'll be a democracy.
I never said we'd be out of there by the end of next year.
You said everything would be fine and it'll be a democracy.
First of all, I didn't say that by the end of next year everything would be fine. I said that we would have a transformational period.
So how long do you think we'll be there?
I think we'll be there for a long time. And
Can you put it 10 years?
No. If I'd sat you down in 1945 and asked you how long are we going to be in Germany, what would you have said? The issue is this. Do we think that we're going to be in Iraq for decades fighting this kind of war with our soldiers taking casualties every day? No. I don't think that's going to happen. Frankly, I don't think it's going to happen because one of two things will happen. Either the violence will subside and the situation will stabilize, and if we continue to be in Iraq, it will be in a way very similar to why we were in Germany, and it will simply be an overseas deployment for our soldiers, or Korea is a better example since there's actually real danger there.
How long do you think it'll be until we get there?
I don't know. The funny thing about war is that, as the Bush administration has repeatedly demonstrated, predictions are not worth a damn. I'm perfectly willing to tell you that I think that we're going to have significant numbers of troops for a while, meaning years. What I hope is that within a few years, the level of violence will have dropped down to the point where we're not fundamentally taking casualties there anymore, and we're not fundamentally patrolling the streets with Iraqis and doing active counterinsurgency. That's my hope. But I can't, if I could make something up for you, but it wouldn't be meaningful.
Okay. Richard, do you have any idea how?
My hunch is that, well, first of all, we cannot sustain anything like the current number of troops that we have in Iraq for the foreseeable future. We can't sustain it. And I'm talking beyond the next, few months into the next year. We have to basically reduce our troop strength in Iraq. Unless we're going to increase the size of the army or reinstall the draft or do something else. And even that doesn't solve the problem immediately. So we are constrained. We are going to have reductions. My hunch is we're going to have reductions down on the order of 80,000 troops. And I think that those 80,000 troops, more or less, are likely to be there for a substantial amount of time to come. 5, 6, 7, 8 years. There are lots of variables. What is our relationship with Iran? Do we maintain a peaceful relationship with Iran? Do we improve our ties to Iran? That would make a substantial difference if we were able to do that. If we're not able to do it, it will make our situation in Iraq perhaps more difficult. How about the internal context within Iraq? In the Shia community, Shias make up, we don't know exactly, there hasn't been a good census in Iraq, but Shias make up at least 60% of the population. Some people think 65% of the population. So that means out of a population of 28 million people, they constitute about 17.5 million people, right? Substantial community. Many of the poor members of that community are not well represented in the current system. They get get better organized? What if Muqtada al-Sadr or some successor to Muqtada al-Sadr organizes them, and you have something that looks a lot like Hezbollah in an Iraqi context? You know, it may be very difficult for us to stay under those circumstances. But you know, taking into account all these variables and agreeing that things can change very dramatically and horribly, I would say it's likely we're going to be there for some time to come, and I would be surprised if all of the forces are withdrawn from Iraq by the end of this next president's two-term presidency.
I'm basically looking for you to take a systemic approach to this. I don't see any talk about how peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians would improve the situation. I don't see any talk about how we literally cannot afford Mr. Kagan's attitude because we will be bankrupt unless we bring in alternative partners through some sort of a regional process. The American economy cannot stand, the government, the military cannot stand to be there like we have been in Germany. Equipment needs to be replaced. We cannot afford your attitude, I humbly assert. So I'd like to hear some sort of a systemic approach to recognizing that we cannot afford this. We have to get out, which means we have to have other people helping. We can't just be America, the imperialists, getting ourselves out of this mess. We need help.
Okay,
I'd like
two
some
questions.
talk on
one
that.
about with the Iraqi people, one about the affordability.
Okay, some, and I know that Senator Biden, being among them, have suggested that the ultimate disposition for Iraq would be some sort of federal state in which
Soft partition.
in which the Shia, the Sunni, and the Kurdish areas would have considerable autonomy, and this would be a way of reducing the sectarian strife that we've seen in the last few years. Do either of you think that's a realistic option, and if not, why not?
Okay, the last question.
And just as a follow-up, if it was a realistic option as far as the Iraqi, the Shiite, Sunnis, etc., to go along that path and separate, should the United States and could it intervene to either stop it or push it forward?
Okay. Richards, I'll let you go.
All right, I'm going to pick up on the last point and then make another point to the gentleman in the audience, if I may. Larry and I were both advisors to the Iraq Study Group, and this question came up repeatedly in the course of the study group deliberations. As you know, the study group was headed by Jim Baker and Lee Hamilton and released their report in December of 2006. And I think the position that most of us agreed on, which strikes me still as a sensible position, is that Iraq might be moving in the direction of the sort of soft partition that Joe Biden is talking about, but the U.S. cannot be in a position where it is endorsing that as a policy objective, because that then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy and accelerates, if you will, the disintegration of the state and maybe brings in neighboring states. And just to put some numbers on, you know, how immense the problems could become, how much worse they can become. Right now, there are 28 million Iraqi citizens, more or less. About 2 million of them have been displaced internally, right? And you have about 1.5 million who are in Syria, about 750,000 in Jordan. So you've got well in excess of 4 million Iraqis already displaced. And by the way, they're not coming back. I talked to a colleague in Baghdad just yesterday morning, actually, about the question of the Syrian refugees. They're still there. They're trickling back, but very small numbers, and they're not coming back from Jordan. So basically, you promote this kind of idea, you accelerate those sorts of people movements, and you potentially destabilize neighboring countries and so on. And then you're left with the big problem of Baghdad, the capital, which is a city with a mixed population of Christians and Kurds and Sunnis and Shiis. And it's very hard to solve that in the partition context. In terms of the gentleman's question at the back about systemic solutions in the Arab-Israeli conflict, look, I agree with you very much that the U.S. needs to be working, or at least I infer your attitude, maybe I'm wrong, but the U.S. needs to be working much more assiduously towards a solution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in particular. And I think that would mitigate some of our problems in the region. We have a horrible public relations problem in the region. I've lived in the Middle East for 9 of the last 18 months. And Egypt, Bahrain, Kuwait, Lebanon, Jordan, Iran, and so on, Israel, and so on. And I must tell you, the level of animosity out there towards the U.S., not to mention the incredulity about U.S. policy in Iraq, is just astounding. And if we could have a sort of success to nail up on the wall, I think that would help a little bit. But it would not help very much with the kind of deep problems that we've all been talking about within Iraq.
Okay, terrific. Fred?
I'll be brief on federalism because I fundamentally agree with Dr. Norton, although I don't think that Iraq is actually heading in that direction anymore. I think that trend has been reversed. I'm very glad, by the way, that the refugees are not coming back because the conditions are not set yet for the refugees to come back, and the concern is at this point that they'll come back too quickly. But we'll see. Look, the fact of the matter is Baghdad remains a mixed city, and it is not divided along any sort of stable border. The river does not divide Sunni Baghdad from Shi'i Baghdad, and there are still mixed neighborhoods on both sides of the river. Diyala, if you look to the northeast of Baghdad, is a very mixed province. And south of Baghdad, in Baghdad province and also in northern Babil province, you still have a lot of mixed areas. If you were going to have a 3 federal region solution, you would either have to come up with some sort of special status for those areas, and it's very hard to imagine anyone really being comfortable with that, or you'd have to have several million more people probably displaced and killed in a further sectarian cleansing. I don't think that it's moving in that direction, and I don't think it's desirable that it move in that direction. Interestingly now, the word that goes around Baghdad streets is, we are a mixed city, we are a mixed community, this is our heritage, and this is the way we want to be, and we are opposed to those who want to turn us into cleansed areas. That's what Baghdadis will tell you. What they tell you and what they do are 2 different things, and got it. But that's the mythos right now that is prevalent there. So I don't think federalism is a good idea, and I entirely agree that the worst possible thing that we could do is endorse it as a plan. As for the Arab-Israeli issue, I've heard no reports whatever of any fighters in Iraq going into battle yelling Allahu Akbar, Golan for the Syrians. You could solve the Palestinian issue tomorrow, and it would have very little effect in Iraq. They are not fighting each other, and they're not fighting us because of the Arab-Israeli problem. That isn't to say that it's not important and we shouldn't address it, but it is to say that we could fix that problem tomorrow, and Iraq would be fundamentally Iraq. Iraqis actually don't really give a damn about Palestinians or Israelis. Iraqis are very proud people, very focused on their own lineage and on their distinctness, and I've never heard an Iraqi express an opinion, except for increasingly Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is now starting to play this card of it's going to be the vanguard in the fight against the Israelis, which tells you actually how desperate they are, because when an Islamist movement moves in the direction of telling you you need to give them money because part of it will go to the Palestinians, you know that they're in real trouble. As for the expense of the war, if I grant your premise that we can't afford this, then my next question would be what makes you think that pulling out will be cheaper? The question is, what are the consequences? You have an obligation, if you're going to make that argument, to lay out the scenarios that you think will evolve in Iraq and in the region, and explain why you think they will be more economically beneficial to the United States of America. Okay, the problem is we only control ourselves. We can't give orders to would-be partners. And we can negotiate with people all we want, but at the end of the day, and I'm in favor of that, and I would like to bring in partners, and I think the Vice President has been going around talking to Arab states and trying to bring them in, and I think we should work very hard to do that. We would have to have a whole other evening to talk about the Iranians. But, and by the way, yes, I'm sure the Iranians would be thrilled to help us out on condition that we give them the country. Absolutely. I'm sure they would not hesitate a moment to make that deal with us, which is what we would be doing, so I'm not in favor of that. But we can't order partners to come, and we can negotiate, but it doesn't mean they'll show up. So the question a responsible strategist has to ask is, given that that's desirable, if it turns out to be impossible, what do we do? And what I don't see is an alternative to trying to succeed at this point, given where we are, that's likely to have a better cost-benefit analysis. The terrific question that was asked, I'm really glad that you brought that question, because that was an outstanding question, is how do the Iraqis feel about our presence? Iraqi attitudes toward our presence have been changing very dramatically over the course of the past 15 months as we have started finally to deliver the one thing that a force that is seen as an occupier can deliver that gives it some sort of legitimacy, namely security. And when you have armed forces in someone else's country and they're still getting blown up and killed every day, then of course no one wants you there. But when you actually are seen to be protecting people from violence, then attitudes change a lot. The role that we're actually in Iraq, in my view, at this point, is one of armed mediation. Both sides, all sides, if you bring in the Kurds and the Christians and so forth, see us as easier to deal with, easier to make deals with than it is to make deals with each other. And that's one of the things that these awakening movements reflect, is the fact that in the Sunni community, which is astonishing given where the Sunni community had been, they trust us more than they trust the Iraqi government. Now, that's obviously bad in the long term. If we can't connect them to the Iraqi government, that's the aim of our policy, and we will succeed or we won't succeed in human affairs. There are no guarantees. But that's the situation that we're in right now. So if you go into Sunni areas now and you say, how do you feel about us staying? Mostly what they'll say is, we want you to stay. We want you eventually to go. You have to promise that you'll leave. We don't want you here forever, but we don't want you to go soon. We want you to help us out for a while. Increasingly, we're hearing that in the Shia areas, and not only are we hearing, we don't want you to leave, we're also hearing, we want you to come. And so there have been vocal requests from areas in the Shia heartland, the 5 cities area, Najaf, Karbala, Diwania, Hila, and Kut, for American PRTs, provincial reconstruction teams, to come, and sometimes even for American forces to come. And Shii in that area that I spoke to said, we will feel good about this next election if there is an American soldier standing on the ballot box. I said, well, that ain't going to happen, so we're going to have to find another way to do this. But that is reflective of attitudes. There is a general understanding among the Iraqi governing elite that our continued presence is essential to maintaining security and any sort of forward progress in that country for years to come. The level of our forces will be something increasingly that we will negotiate with the Iraqis. And that's why I think it's so unfortunate that the issue of what the administration calls a long-term security agreement, it is in fact what they're really negotiating is a status of forces agreement, which is a bilateral agreement that gives us legal rights to be in Iraq, negotiated directly with Iraq rather than through the United Nations, has become such a controversial issue. Because, in fact, that's the way sovereign states deal with one another. And what should be going on here is that the Iraqi government should be communicating with the American government about the force levels of American troops that it desires and what it wants them to do, and we present our views, and we come to a negotiation, and that's the way it should be. By the way, that traditionally has been the way it has been, more or less, with the Maliki government since 2007. We are not there in greater strength than the Iraqi government wants us to be there, and we are not talking about being there in greater strength than the Iraqi government is talking about. I have detected no divergence between our positions about force levels and the Iraqi positions, except sometimes the Iraqis will tell you that they wish we had more forces there.
Okay. Well, on that note, let's bring this to a conclusion. 2 things. If you've got more questions, you can ask our panelists in the room next door at the reception. But please join me in thanking them very much for their discussion. Thank you.
Very good.
Okay.
Very good.
All right.